You're listening to episode 698 of People Behind the Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely. In this episode, we are rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Melissa Franklin, originally published on April 10th of 2017. Listeners, Melissa's research aims to better understand the nature of space and time by colliding particles using large particle accelerators. She was co-discoverer of the top quark and the Higgs boson, and in 1992, Melissa became the first woman to be granted tenure in the physics department at Harvard University. And in our conversation, Melissa talks more about her life and her science. So listeners, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Melissa Franklin. So, Melissa, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. How are you?
Thanks. I'm very well.
Excellent. Well, we are excited to chat with you more about your work and your career. But before we dive into the details, I want to give our listeners just a little bit of background to orient them here. So, listeners, Melissa is the Mallinckrodt Professor of Physics at Harvard University. She completed her undergraduate studies in physics at the University of Toronto and received her PhD in physics from Stanford University. Next, Melissa conducted research as a postdoctoral fellow at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and she served on the faculty of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and was a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows at Harvard before joining the faculty there. Now, Melissa has been named a fellow of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and a fellow of the American Physical Society, and she has been awarded the Spark Award for Women in Science from the Women in Science at Harvard-Radcliffe, as well as a doctorate degree in law from Queen's University in Canada. And now Melissa is here with us today, listeners, to tell us about her experiences in life and science. So, Melissa, I'd like to start first by talking about your life outside of science and how you spend your time. So can you tell us what you like to do?
Yeah, sure. I like to walk a lot, and I read a lot, and I watch films a lot, and I listen to music. That's it. So what do I do most? I like walking and talking. That's fun. About books and films.
Wonderful. I like how you package them all together. That's great.
Yeah. Well, you have to do that.
Yeah. Multitasking. So what's your favorite place to walk?
There's a place here in Cambridge. There's a pond and people just walk round and round and round the pond. It's sort of like the Greeks.
Excellent. So now you mentioned you like reading as well. And I always like to chat about books with people who come on our show. So I have to ask, Melissa, if you had to give us a book recommendation today, and this can be a science book or a non-science book, what do you think me and my listeners should pick up?
There's a great new book, and I remember the name, by Hope Jaron.
Mm-hmm. Is it Lab Girl?
Lab Girl, yeah.
Yes.
It is probably the best science book I've read in a decade.
Definitely. I've read that one. I think she really captures the essence of life as a scientist well.
Yeah, and she shows that scientists can be pretty wild.
Definitely. Well, we will put that on our list of recommended books for our listeners to find on our website. And we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science, Melissa, but I do want to talk about your scientific side next. So can you tell us how you described your work to someone who might not at all be familiar with you or your field?
Usually what I say is I'm trying to understand the nature of space and time. That's the overall thing. And the way I do that is to try and excite space-time. I try to make things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. So the way I do that is with big particle accelerators, and I collide particles together. So I like to put a lot of energy in a very small space in a very short time and see what happens.
I love it. Well, Melissa, that is a beautiful description, understanding the nature of space and time.
Yeah.
So can you tell us now about what motivates you as a scientist? I love getting little bits of motivation, little quotes and sayings from everyone I talk to. So do you have a favorite quote or saying that really keeps you going?
I don't have a favorite quote, but I sort of do, but it's more like a bumper sticker, which is, I'd rather do nothing than waste my time. It does apply. I know it sounds a little odd, but it does apply to what we do in science, that what we decide to work on. Sometimes it's okay to just sit and do absolutely nothing rather than to start on something which is not going to lead anywhere.
Well, Melissa, I love that saying. And I think as a scientist, there are perhaps few and far between moments where you actually find yourself having the opportunity to do nothing. So I actually value these moments of doing nothing quite a bit.
I'm looking forward to one soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark that in your schedule. I think you have to.
Yeah.
So can you take us back to your scientific journey and tell us about some of the people who you have encountered throughout your path who might have helped motivate or inspire you to pursue science, or maybe mentors you had along the way?
That's interesting. I was just conversing over email with, I think, a young girl in second grade who had to do a report on a woman scientist. And she was asking me about second grade, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I do realize that probably the first thing that got me going was when the principal of my elementary school taught us how to play chess.
Interesting.
I got very interested in it, and I really liked playing it. It wasn't bad. And it seemed my first way into sort of logic, sustained thought about things, algorithms, things like that. So that was, I guess, the beginning. I don't remember anything about science in elementary school otherwise. And I know this is going far back, but to understand when I got interested in science, you have to somehow realize that at some point I realized that math was really easy. Unfortunately, I didn't have a very good math education, but it seemed like something that made sense. So that was nice. And then I quit high school when I was 13 to become part of a free school. And there we adopted a different approach to learning. And science was sort of episodic. It wasn't really sustained learning. We somehow realized that if you could do 12th grade, or in Canada it was 13th grade, science, then you could get into college. You didn't really have to do 9, 10, 11, and 12.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have a very good science education, but then I left even there and went traveling to Europe and got interested in philosophy. And by reading philosophy, I started reading the books of the people who developed quantum mechanics, which is this theory about physics at very, very small distances, like atoms. And through those people writing, Heisenberg, Bohr, etc., writing about what they had done, I became very interested in quantum mechanics. And that was my route. So from literature, philosophy into quantum mechanics, and then I went into physics.
So at that point, did you know that you wanted to be a physicist? Was this sort of a goal you were working towards?
No, I don't want to be a physicist.
Even today.
No, I never wanted to be something. And honestly, as a young girl, it never occurred to me that I could be a physicist.
Mm-hmm.
Or that it was something I wanted to be. I grew up in a family where academics were considered to be very narrow and boring and kind of annoying. Like there was a much broader world of intellectual thought than academia.
Interesting.
That's where I come from. Well, there is something to that. Sorry, I know you're an academic and I'm an academic.
That's all right. I don't take it personally.
But no, I never thought of myself. I always thought I'd be a great writer or philosopher or filmmaker. I thought I'd be somebody really great. And I thought, I'm just going to study physics right now because it's really interesting. And I'm going to go as far as I find it interesting, and then I'm going to stop. But that time never actually came, the stopping time. So I didn't have an idea of myself as a professor. Definitely not. And I still don't really have that idea in my head.
Well, it's great to get some insight into this maybe more non-traditional path into science. So I know there's an interesting story about how you got into college. So can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
So I didn't really have a high school diploma, so I didn't really have the requirements to get into college, but I thought I could talk my way in. Mm-hmm. I lived in Toronto, so I just went down to the University of Toronto every day for about 34 days during the summer. And I talked to different people and I took some tests and everything. And I just said, you really do want me because I know what I want to do and I want to do physics and I'm really smart. Mm-hmm. And eventually they said, yes. I think it was just at the very beginning. But then I can tell you that I didn't do very well in my first year of college because I didn't really know how to study or how much to study, really. And that's been a sort of theme throughout my career, which is knowing how long it takes to actually learn something. That is, how much do you have to study? How long do you have to try to understand something? And that follows through into research as well. It's very hard for most people to know what length of time is the right amount of time.
Well, I love this confidence that you display just walking into the University of Toronto saying, listen, this is going to work out. You want me. You should let me in here. Was there ever a moment where you doubted yourself?
I'm always doubting myself, but I'm doubting other people more.
Gotcha.
No, of course, they would have been completely correct in not accepting me. But on the other hand, there's 60,000 students, and what can they lose, right?
Yeah.
So that was very nice that they let me in. And the University of Toronto was very supportive. I had wonderful professors there.
So now, can you tell us what maybe helped you shape what direction your career was going to go next? How did you decide to pursue a PhD?
So when I was an undergraduate, I got interested in particle physics, quantum mechanics. Again, I finally got to learn quantum mechanics properly. And I got interested in particle physics. There was a group at my university doing particle physics experiments at Fermilab, which is a big national lab outside of Chicago. And so I asked, can I go and work there during the summer? And they said no. They had already hired people. And I said, okay, I'll work for free.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, yes.
Free is always better. Yeah.
Free is always better. So I went down there and I couldn't believe it because I come from a family where people, they write and they read and they drink. And this was a place where people were drilling and building things and writing computer codes and doing physical things and calculational things and intellectual things all in one. It was the best possible thing. You could drive a big truck, you could drill into concrete, you could write computer programs, you could glue things together, and at the end, you were learning something about the most fundamental thing in the universe, what the universe is made of.
It's like a scientific playground, yeah.
And also you could stay up all night. I got completely hooked on that combination of things, like not having to do just one thing all the time. For instance, I'm an experimentalist, which means that I build experiments and take data and analyze the data. But theorists sit in their office and make theories. I would hate that.
Mm-hmm.
That would not be a good thing to do. I'm not a person who can sit still for very long and do the same thing. So probably for the same reason I wasn't able to stay in high school and just sit in the classroom, I have to be an experimentalist. So how did I decide to do particle physics? Well, there is only particle physics. First of all, I spent the first 30 years of my life trying to figure out what were the particles, if we just say very elementary particles that make up all of the world. What are they? What are the constituents of the atom? And even below that, what are the constituents of nucleons, of protons and neutrons? That was just so fascinating. Now we realize that's actually a very small part of the universe, that particles and matter is just like 4% of the universe, apparently. So I guess I kind of wasted my time. But nobody still knows really how to try and understand the rest of it. But anyway, I think I went to graduate school because I so much wanted to go back to a laboratory and be part of these big experiments and learn electronics and learn everything much better.
Definitely. And now you mentioned that you did your PhD at Stanford University. Can you talk about your experiences there and then your subsequent postdoc at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory?
Stanford was great. I was a bad student. I almost fell out of graduate school a couple of times, either for feeling like an outsider or for being a bad student. But I had an incredible group of fellow graduate students. I spent a lot of time in graduate school thinking, am I smart enough? I'm not smart enough. Am I smart enough? I'm not smart enough. It was a complete waste of time. Right. Really, there's better ways to use your time than thinking about that.
Melissa, I'm sure this is so reassuring for people out there who are maybe struggling in graduate school and having this internal conflict themselves. So yeah, go on.
So what happened was there would be problem sets you'd have to do and you wouldn't know how to do them and you'd look at them and you'd just cry. But then there were other women who are still my friends now who are generally in the physics graduate program. And you would cry and they would laugh and they would say, let's do the problem set. Or they would cry and you would say the same thing. It was a kind of support network that was pretty great. Some of the people in that program who have been chairs of the physics department at Stanford and Berkeley and at Harvard. So it was really an incredible group of people who also were extremely supportive. So I don't know how that happened, but I was incredibly lucky.
Definitely. Well, this sounds like a wonderful experience, a wonderful group of people to be going through that experience together with. And then we did mention you transitioned to the postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Was this an exciting place to work as well? Did you still have that supportive environment?
So that was interesting. When I graduated from the PhD, I thought seriously about going into industry. I think that would be nice. And I didn't think I was a very good physicist, so it didn't really matter. But I was in love with some guy, and he had a job at Stanford, so I figured I'd like to stick around. Mm-hmm. So I took a job at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, but I have to say that really the reason I took that job is the person who hired me was someone I had worked with before and was really a great person and incredibly supportive. So I think I didn't learn as much in graduate school as I should have because I spent so much time thinking about the fact that I wasn't smart. Mm-hmm. But I made up for it by sort of having a second graduate education as a postdoc. And this person was just the perfect person for me to work with because they just assumed I was smart until otherwise, or assumed I knew something until I showed that I didn't or asked about it. Whereas there's all kinds of other people who assume you're stupid until you show you're smart.
Right, right.
He was just fantastic. That was a really fun job. Everybody told me, here's a job where you'll never get an assistant professorship because you're not going to have data before the job is over. And I said, I don't really care. this seems like a really good job. And it was building a detector, which I love to do. And it was a wonderful experience.
Excellent. And then you actually did get that assistant professorship afterwards at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. How did that come about?
Well, that's amazing. I did apply for faculty positions. I never really expected to get one. I didn't get a bunch of them, but I had worked with the people at Illinois on my experiment before, and they'd sort of seen me work, and they said, okay, University of Illinois is just a fantastic physics department, incredibly inclusive and smart and just strong. And they were very nice to hire me. But I didn't stay very long for various reasons. I got a fellowship to go to Harvard, which I took. I thought I would just take for a year, but ended up staying forever.
Well, I love this story, Melissa. And I think, like I said, sharing these stories with listeners out there who might be going through their own scientific journey is really reassuring, because you can be less than ideal graduate student and still go on to have a successful career in science. So thank you so much for sharing your story. But I'm curious to hear about something that you have going on now in the lab at Harvard today that you are really excited to be working on. So can you share one of your current projects with us?
Yes. Well, we discovered the Higgs boson. That's the last particle in the Standard Model, the last one we're expecting. It's a particle which is sort of an excitation of a field that permeates all space. Kind of cool. And yeah, we found it. We were great. Somebody got a Nobel Prize, not me. And so the next thing you want to do once you find a particle, you want to see whether there's another particle that decays into it. So can we use this particle we just discovered to find something else? Can we use it as a tool now that we have found it? So I have a graduate student who's looking for a new particle. We call it X because we don't know what it is and we don't know if it exists, which would decay to 2 Higgs bosons. And that's very fun. So this is the kind of thing we do. We take a lot of data. We collide protons every 25 nanoseconds for a year. And then we look for things that might or might not exist, a particle which might just decay to these 2 particles. And then it's very hard to look for those. There's huge amounts of data that we take, and then you have to try and look for a tiny little signal in that data. So that part is extremely fun, this kind of data mining.
So can you tell us, how do you do this? I mean, this sounds like a really daunting task. You have a year of data that you're kind of wading through. How do you search for it? Do you have computer algorithms that you work with, or is it something where you're visualizing the data?
Well, I work with 3,000 physicists on this experiment, and everybody is doing their little piece to make it all work, including taking that data and putting it into a form that makes sense and is easier to work with. And so in the end, we were able to not personally have to sift through every single event, but a group of people will prepare the data that looks sort of something like what we're looking for. And then we have to just look through that data. But we do have to know a lot of statistics, and we have to sort of be kind of clever. And this is a place where little clever ideas can come in. And I think that's very exciting for everyone to try and be clever.
Absolutely. And I'm sure there's no typical day really for anyone as a scientist, because there's a lot of variety in what you do, which is the fun part. But can you give us an example of maybe what a good day collecting data would look like for you, or a good day doing research?
Again, it's a huge experiment and people take shifts. So you go in for 8 hours a day for 5 days into the main control room, and you make sure that we're taking data and the data is good as we're taking it. So the data is being taken whether I'm here or not. I could stay here for a year and the data would still be taken by a bunch of different people. So it's possible to feel disconnected from that data taking and still be part of the experiment. Mm-hmm. I personally prefer to be there in the control room. I like to see what's happening. I like to know how the data is being taken. But I teach physics here at Harvard, so I can't go there. So there's an enormous amount of Skype, and there's an enormous amount of video conference meetings where you follow what's happening there just on your computer. You're listening to people talking. You're watching what's happening in the control room because you can do that. So there's a lot of distance work, I guess. And then half of my group is over there, so I'm constantly Skyping with them and asking them what's going on. So there's a lot of email, Skype, and video conferencing. And then there's some flying back and forth to Geneva. This all takes place in Geneva, Switzerland. And then there's banging your head against the wall trying to figure stuff out. Your student makes a plot of something, a histogram, something that describes the data, and then you can't understand it, and you just look at it for a long time and try and figure out what it's telling you. What story is that data telling you? That's sort of what I work on.
Well, this sounds like a fun puzzle then to be putting together, looking at all this data, trying to understand it and put the pieces together. Now that you mentioned you go to Geneva, Switzerland to go to, is it CERN's over there, yes?
CERN, yeah.
Can you tell us how often are you able to make it over there? You mentioned you have a lot of teaching responsibilities here in the U.S.
Yeah, when I'm not teaching, I go about once a month for about a week. When I am teaching, I go about once a semester, but then I also go in the summer. What's good is when I'm on sabbatical, then I can go for 6 months at a time. That's really nice.
Very cool.
But I'm pretty old. Some of the younger people have more energy and can go all the time. You have to take 2 flights to get there from Boston.
Right.
It would be nice if there was a Concorde and it went straight from Boston to Geneva.
Yeah, travel takes a lot out of you. It can be exhausting sometimes.
Yeah. But I have to say, being at CERN is just so much fun. First of all, when you're at CERN, we live in these kind of barracks. They're like little IKEA rooms.
This sounds wonderful.
Yeah, just what you need, and you can just concentrate. You don't have to think about anything else. You don't have to think about fixing your house, getting a new couch, whatever. You just are thinking about the physics. And after a while, that gets completely crazy. But the great thing is that you go outside there, and it's so beautiful. The mountains and everything. It's so beautiful that it's just overwhelming. So then you go back inside.
Right.
It's a really great place to work. There are brilliant people and lots of people and even some funny people, just a few.
Right. Are you one of the funny people, Melissa?
I'm not sure.
We'll have to poll your colleagues.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Melissa, it sounds like you've had a wonderful experience working on this particular project, working with your collaborators at CERN. And I think we've made it sound like a grand adventure. And I think science is a lot of the time, but there are frustrations and obstacles and downsides to it as well. And I do love to share those with our listeners because I think it is really important to get this holistic picture of what life is like as a scientist and not just the good days. So can you tell us about one of these struggles or frustrations that you've faced and how you've gotten through it?
Well, there's lots of frustrations. There's people not treating you as you'd like to be treated with respect. There's not getting the funding that you want. I think those are the big 2. First of all, it's a little bit of a struggle for women because there aren't very many. There are a lot more now. I think somehow we now have 5 women graduate students in our group. But when I started, it was just really me and maybe another person in the world, not very many people. And being a minority in any situation is complicated. And then being a complicated person in a situation which is complicated is more complicated.
Just adding layers of complication. Yeah.
The kind of women who might go into physics might be a little complicated. By complicated, I mean, of course, smart and tall and interesting. Mm-hmm. I was just kidding about the tall.
They might be tall. Yeah.
If you're Canadian, it could be tall and interesting. So there's always this struggle of feeling like you're part of what's happening, that you're not an outsider. Later in life, you realize that almost everybody like at Harvard, the physics department, everyone's an outsider. I think it's a kind of outsider place. Not just Harvard. I mean, physics or science. It's a group of really interesting, quirky, goofy, wonderfully smart, and sometimes funny people. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I struggled with a lot of things, like people treating you more in terms of sexual terms than in terms of intellectual terms. But we struggle through all these things, and then we get to the end, and then we die.
Right. The end is the same for everyone.
So, yeah, a lot of times people will be against you because you're a woman and because they sort of fear that, or they fear that you're not really a scientist. I don't know what they really fear, but they can be pretty mean. And I've had bad things happen. I almost took a job at a university where when I finally got the job offer, a couple of people brought me into their offices and just said, "You're not smart. We know that, just so you know," that kind of thing.
That's devastating.
Luckily, I didn't think they were that smart.
Right.
Honestly, I'm not sure that being smart is the most important thing, or being smart in a certain way. I'm not sure that how well you do on a problem set or on a test is really a measure of how well you'll do in science. Mm-hmm. I think interest is important. But even more than that, this is what I think. There's a lot of people who can make a contribution to science, and I'm one of them. And the fact that I'm able to do that now, that women are able to make a contribution to science, is pretty great. 100 years ago, that was extremely hard. And that's what's important, is wanting to make that contribution and making sure that you can make it. And people telling you that you can't do that, they've obviously got a problem.
Well, I'm glad you didn't listen to those people, Melissa.
Well, they try and cut your legs down so that you're just walking on your knees, but it doesn't always work. Anyhow, I think things are getting a lot better. Everybody's growing up. Everybody's learning that lots of people can make contributions to science.
Certainly. And I know you were the first woman tenured faculty in the physics department at Harvard. Can you tell us, how has the department changed since that time in 1992?
It was a great department. Obviously, they somehow decided to let me in. I used to say that the great thing about the Harvard physics department is that everybody is so sure of themselves that they don't need to put you down. they're not even thinking about you.
They've got so much else on their minds. Yeah.
So people are pretty supportive, and I like it. I like also that there's more women, and I think we've all struggled with what that means in terms of how to be supportive. This is not really like an ad for the Harvard Physics Department, but one thing we've done over the past 30 years is try to make Harvard the place where all women who want to do graduate school want to go.
I like it.
Find all the best women across the world and make them come here to Harvard. And what has happened, there's been some years where we've been really successful at that, and we get something like 40% of our graduate class is female, and it completely changes the feeling. Don't ask me how. Mm-hmm. That's one thing that has changed a lot here. And I think it's changed also because we have more women on the faculty, but also because everybody is really engaged in this idea.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your experiences. And I know it can be a challenge almost being a pioneer or being within the minority. And I think physics in particular is an area of science that even still, women are a small percentage of the especially upper echelon faculty members. So I think it's wonderful to hear that you're seeing more women coming into the field in science. So that's great.
No, but the real women pioneers were in the early 1900s. Those were wild women. They were really smart.
And fearless, I think, too.
And fearless. Oh, my God. Yeah. Those were women who would, for instance, there was like a war going on, maybe the First World War, something like that. And they would, in order to do physics, they would travel through war-torn Europe in order to get to labs. They were pretty wild people. When I grew up, I want to be like that.
Absolutely.
I don't have much time.
You've got plenty of time, Melissa. Come on. Just got to move quickly. Well, Melissa, thank you for sharing one of these challenges that you've faced in science. And we don't just want to talk about the tough times. Can you tell us next about an exciting moment of success that you experienced in science?
Well, I work on an experiment again with 3,000 people. And then there's another experiment, the experiment which is supposed to check our experiment if we find something, with another 3,000 people. These are rough numbers.
Sure.
Together, both of these experiments discovered this new particle in 2012, the Higgs boson. Now, when there's so many people, I can't say I discovered that particle, but we're all part of making the detector, making it work, getting the data, doing parts of the analysis. All are connected in some way, and we all feel like we've made some contribution so that happened. So that, I think, was an incredible success. Finding a particle is honestly, what could be better than that?
Right.
There's only 20 particles that make up all of the world. I already been an experiment to discover one of them, the top quark, and this is another one. This is something that will never go away. This is something that forever we will now know there is a Higgs field and a Higgs boson in this particle that interacts with all the other particles in some way. And that's an incredible feeling of having made a contribution to the world.
Definitely. Well, it sounds thrilling to have been part of this collective effort. Was there a particular way that you celebrated?
Well, no, that's the weird thing. Well, there was a celebration. I wasn't over at CERN when it was announced, but all my students were over there. First of all, they had to sleep inside the lecture hall in order to get a seat.
Oh, wow.
But I was Skyping with them while they were there. I think they were a little drunk too, but that must have been very exciting. Of course, I do a lot of things just watching on a screen. But yeah, I think the excitement isn't something like a one-day excitement. Oh, I'm so excited I got a job. But this is something that lasts a long time. This is the kind of thing where that summer, you're sort of walking through the city and you think about this field that you've just discovered, that you're walking through, that you can't feel. And it took all of that money and all of those people to be able to figure out it was there. And you think about what that means, about what you have learned about the space you live in. So I'm very interested in this. You take all of matter out of the world and then you ask, what is there? So when I'm walking, I like to think about that and I like to imagine what it is that's there. What is the energy that's there? I know I'm sounding like a crazy person now, but it's okay. This is what physicists do. They build things and then they feel crazy things.
Slowly dissect them in their minds. Yeah. Well, this sounds like a wonderful and exciting endeavor to be a part of. And congratulations to you and the whole group on that success. I think, like you said, finding a particle, that's something that's going to go down in history. And these are the stories you can tell your grandkids and be excited about. So that's phenomenal. And we've talked a little bit about some of the travel that you've done as part of your career, and particularly traveling back and forth between CERN. And I think travel is a huge part of the life of a scientist. So can you share with us, what is your favorite travel experience you've had and maybe where you've been and why?
I'm not sure about a favorite travel experience, but I've always enjoyed going somewhere to another laboratory and working at that laboratory. And I remember once I went to a high energy physics laboratory in Japan. It's far away. I went for 4 days and we just worked at the accelerator for those 4 days. And then I don't remember sleeping. That's the thing. And going into Tokyo, one of these 4 days, you're in the lab for 3.5 days. You go into Tokyo and you eat 800 kinds of fish. And then you get on the plane and go home. So that's a kind of experience where you're not a tourist. You're working in the lab, but you're experiencing that place in a very, very condensed way. I don't know why I think of that as such a great experience, but I love that feeling that science, it doesn't matter where you are. It's sort of the same everywhere. You can go there and do the science, which is sort of everywhere the same, and then eat really different food. I guess I really like eating food.
I do too. You're not alone there. Well, I love this universal excitement and enthusiasm and dedication to the science that you're talking about. And I think you're absolutely right. You see that anywhere. You can drop in a lab in Japan and Europe, in the United States and Canada, anywhere. And the scientists, sort of the one quality that everyone shares is that dedication and enthusiasm about the work.
Yeah.
And of course, you had plenty of time to catch up on your sleep on the flight home.
I did. Nobody on that flight. I remember I had like 6 seats.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's even better than I was imagining. Well, thanks so much for sharing one of these travel opportunities. And I think throughout our conversation, we've sort of hinted at some of the people in science and what makes them so wonderful. And I think the variety is a huge part of it. And I think different labs get these quirky traditions that develop as a result of the people there, or you just meet people who are hilarious and do crazy things. So can you share one of these stories that you've experienced of this human side of science?
If you walk around the halls of my building where I work, the physics department, there's always people wandering around. They're clearly lost in thought. They just walk up and down the halls thinking about physics. And it's just such a wonderful thing. Like, I love the fact that when anybody has a free moment, they're thinking about a problem. They're thinking about a problem in physics. This is the idea I love, that when you wake up in the morning, you start thinking about this problem. You don't feel forced to think about the problem. It's not like a grant proposal or something like that. You're just thinking about the problem. And you get into the shower, you're still thinking about the problem. And that is what goes through your whole day. You may do a whole bunch of different things. You may go to a movie, you may teach a class or whatever, but throughout that whole thing is this feeling of working on a problem and losing yourself in that problem. So when I say quirky, a lot of the professors and other people in the building are just moving around thinking about problems. And you can see that. And they're funny. But quirky, well, there's so many quirky things. We used to have a professor who would rent a car and then bring it to the department in the parking lot and then forget they had rented it for a month.
That's impressive.
There are people who were going to the airport. They have forgotten something in their house. They would drive to their house, leave the car running, go into the house, order a cab and go to the airport. People are thinking about things. They don't always take care of the very simple day-to-day things. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of nice. But I don't want to give the idea that physicists are typically absent-minded. A lot of them are just normal people.
I think I'm guilty myself, too. I've done the thing where I've driven to work and then taken the Metrolink, the train home. So I definitely can relate.
I know.
Well, thanks so much for sharing some of the characters, some of the qualities I think that make science such a fun place to work and make scientists a fun group of people to work with, because you are so deeply immersed in some of these questions that you're working on that they do kind of permeate your whole day. And we've talked about some of the questions that you're answering today. And I'm curious, if we gave you everything, Melissa, all of the funding, the staff, the technology, any feasibility constraints that you need, what is the one question that you yourself would want to answer?
There's so many questions, but there's this thing called dark matter, which bends light and it has gravitational effects, and we don't know what it's made of. I'd really like to know. I'd really like to know what dark matter is, if it's a particle, if it's made of particles or whatever. I'd really like to know that, and I'd like to do experiments to find that out. However, I'm not sure just funding would help.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. How would you try and figure that out?
I don't know. But here's the thing. I'm not sure I'd just like to know, for instance, if there was a super being who already knew the answer, would I ask them just to tell me? Mm-hmm. Do I just want to know the answer to it? I'm not that kind of person. I think I really want to find it out myself, whatever it is. So if I could push a button and say, what is dark matter? And someone would tell me, I probably wouldn't push it.
That's interesting. I might push it, but then try and figure it out also to corroborate the button push answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So on our experiment right now, if dark matter is made of certain things, we're sensitive to that. We may be able to see it. I think that would be the really, really, really most exciting next thing. If I had a lot of money, I'm not sure what I would do.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of interesting things I'd like to do. I mean, I know this has nothing to do with particle physics, but I'm interested in how do you make scientists, not just white men? How do you make scientists from all other groups of people? It would be interesting for me to do a study of where all, for instance, just take women scientists who are now successful. Where did they come from? Who did they interact with? What kind of environment did they grow up in? That would be really interesting to me. That's a sort of separate thing. I'd like to know the answer to that. Then we could just recreate those situations everywhere, and science would then be open to everyone. That would be great.
That would be wonderful. Well, thanks so much for sharing these questions and thinking big with us today. I love this big question about the universe. What is dark matter made of? And this idea of trying to tease apart how to involve women, minorities, and all different groups within STEM. I think this is an important thing. We're getting better, I think, over time, but I think there's still so much work left to do. And we've talked a little bit about your experiences in science. And Melissa, I want to give you an opportunity today to think about your experiences and the advice that you've received over the course of your career. And can you tell us, is there one piece of advice that really helped you that you can share with me and our listeners today?
People can actually give you advice and you can listen, or you can sort of glean something from the way they behave. At some point, I was living with a scientist and I was struggling just by living in the same house. I realized that this person, even though they were very successful, how hard they worked, how long they worked, how many hours they spent on something in order to be successful. And I had not understood that. And I think it's extremely hard for young people to know how long is long enough before they should expect to be successful. Actually, one of my graduate students gave me a piece of advice. It wasn't for me, but it was a good piece of advice. You should still continue to do physics if the time it takes to solve a problem is shorter than your interest time. That is, if you lose interest before you solve the problem, then maybe it's not a good idea. But if your interest stays long enough for you to solve the problem, then that says you should stay at physics.
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head here that science is not a good career path for the impatient, and maybe physics in particular. So you do often have to put in a lot of hours, and sometimes these experiments run for years before you really get the results out.
What, 30 years? I was on an experiment for 30 years. I don't know how people know how long to spend on problem sets at school and projects in the lab. Nobody tells you what the right length of time is. I mean, Americans sometimes just think that if you spend all your time, you just sit in the lab all day long, right, then that's good. But that's actually not the same. Just being there is not the same as concentrating on something. So I don't know. I think that's the biggest piece of advice. And obviously I got it from a graduate student. Wow.
I love that. So is there any other last piece of advice you want to leave our listeners with, or a last note of inspiration you'd like to end our conversation on, Melissa?
Finding things out about the universe in whatever science it is, including social science, is possibly the most satisfying thing in the world. That makes me happy. So I don't feel so bad about just being a sort of run-of-the-mill scientist. I like the whole run-of-the-mill scientist kind of thing. I'm very proud to be a run-of-the-mill scientist. I'm not sure which mill we're talking about.
Who's running it? Yeah. Well, I think that is a wonderful message to leave our listeners with. And listeners, I hope that everyone out there finds that one thing that you love to do that makes them so happy. So, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Can you tell our listeners how they can learn more about you and your work?
I teach at Harvard. It's easy to find me there if you want to ask me a question by email. I don't have a great website. I should get a better website and then put things on it. But the work I do at CERN, you can just go to the Atlas experiment at CERN and look at that, or send me email.
Perfect. Well, Melissa, thanks again so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Great. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.